So hello and welcome everyone. In this video, which I anticipate will going to be relatively short, I will talk about generally the analytic static distinction in philosophy, in the traditional philosophy. And I will also talk about Quine's critique of the analytic static distinction, where he thinks that the distinction is taken absolutely, is not really tenable, it's not really sustainable, not really rationally maintainable. And I will also offer my own sort of critique of the Kantian, not the Kantian, the Quinean critique of the analytic static distinction, and I will try to argue that the distinction is actually can hold. We can actually divide, at least generally, we can divide sentences into analytic and synthetic, and that is more or less a stable distinction. And we need not, as Quine wants us to do, we need not admit that all sentences that can be true are synthetic, right? Only synthetic. So I will start by talking about generally the analytic static distinction. Well, the analytic static distinction is introduced in philosophical lingo and philosophical terminology to make a distinction between those types of sentences which are or can be true in virtue of the meaning alone of the constituent terms, and those which are true by virtue of the meaning plus some relevant facts of the world, some objective states of affairs in the world, in objective reality, empirical reality, if you wish. Now, there are I would say there are two types of analytic sentences, analytic propositions, if you wish, and those would be those. Even Quine admits that kind of distinction. Those would be the analytic truths, the analytic sentences that are true or can be true merely in virtue of the logical form. So, for example, the sentence A equals A, right? Where we do not really need to know what the sign A signifies. We only need to know that the sign is repeated, right? Whatever interpretation we give to the relevant sign A, under all interpretations, the uses of A will be coincident or will be coextensive with the uses of A because it's simply pretty much the same term, the same sign. So that's one type of analytic statement. Another type is that is not true merely or can be true merely in virtue of the logical form or the syntactic form, but we must also take into consideration the relevant meanings of the relevant terms, of the constituent terms of the statement, right? So, for example, a very common example: all bachelors are unmarried men, are unmarried male human beings, if you wish. So we don't really need to go into the world and examine all bachelors or pretty much any bachelor to know that bachelors are unmarried men, because they are unmarried men by definition. It is in the very meaning of the word bachelor to be an unmarried man. That is like classic orthodox rendition of analytic truths. And also, I can give another example. For example, brothers are male siblings. Again, to take some kind of familiar relations. Brothers are male siblings of a certain type, right? That's just another example. But first, I will say something about the supposed pure formal nature of the first type of analytic statement. So I too would argue, I'm not sure who else would argue that kind of thing, but I would argue that, for example, if you say a chair is a chair, right? Take a very simple example. A chair is a chair. That's supposed to be true. We don't even need to take into consideration the meaning of the term chair, right? Because whatever the term chair means, it means the same thing in both its uses, right? So that's why every chair is a chair, right? There simply is no other possibility. But I will say that that kind of, for example, that kind of statement, actually, the truth of that kind of statement actually depends on the exclusion or elimination of homonymy, right? So we need to establish that, you know, the two uses of the word chair are actually the uses of the same word with the same meaning. They're not merely homonymous. They're not merely, you know, words which have the same linguistic form but have different meanings, right? For instance, what example would I give of homonymy? I'm not sure right now. Maybe I'll remember. For example, take a head, like the word head, right? It can mean like a human or any kind of animal head, or it can mean, for example, I don't know, head of a needle. It's maybe not the best example, but that's just what comes to mind right now. Because the head of a needle is not a head in the same sense that, right, that an organ or a whole part of the body is a head, right? Uh, so right, so that kind of statement, chair is a chair, depends on it's not being homonymous, so not being case of the same linguistic form with different meanings. And I will also argue that for instance, all formal logical truths, supposed truths, right, actually do not just depend merely on the logical form of the judgment, of the statement, of the proposition, but also depend at least partly on it is partly on semantics, and it is partly on the meaning of or the type of meaning of the constituent terms. For instance, I'll give you an example. In predicate calculus, right, we take predicate logic, and for instance, the uppercase letters, symbols in predicate logic are supposed to stand for predicates, right? Supposed to stand for some kind of a property or some kind of action, for instance, that is attributable to a certain subject, to a certain substance, if you want to put it in Aristotelian terms, right? Because not just any kind of word can play the role of a predicate. So we also at least partly need to take into consideration semantics, or the type of word that the uppercase letter signifies, or is a shorthand for, right? Because, for instance, names cannot really be predicates, right? To give you a quite maybe not that intuitive example, but I think it's very defensible, the kind of theory that says the names cannot really be predicated of anything. Proper names, right? For example, Aristotle, if we understand Aristotle in a certain kind of way, I think Aristotle would agree with that, right? Because it says primary substances. Names are supposed to name or signify particulars, very specified and concrete particulars, isolated particulars, independent particulars, particular things. And that's why Aristotle says that primary substances cannot really be attributed to anything, cannot be predicated of anything, right? Because they do not really have that kind of general form that can be merely an aspect of something. That's pretty much the whole thing, right? They're the whole thing, and they're not generally significant, or they cannot really be be applied to more than one case. So that's one thing I would say here. But also if we talk about formal logic, we can talk about logical connectives, right? Like and, or if then, right? Or and is conjunction, if then is implication, or if and only if, which is equivalence, or not, which is negation. Those are all logical connectives, and all of them actually are not merely just empty signifiers, are not really just empty symbols, empty signs on a sheet or whatever other whatever other medium we use to write logical statements on, because they also have a meaning. They are propositional connectives. They're using propositional logic to connect different propositions, or well, for example, not is not used to connect two propositions, but is used merely to negate a single proposition, which may also be complex. But not, for instance, is not really a connection between different propositions in propositional logic. It is a it is a unary relation. I think that's how it's understood. While and or if then are I guess binary relations, or relations that hold between two or more propositions. But we also need to understand what we are supposed to signify or convey by those symbols, because they have a given meaning, right, within the logical system. And also the quantifiers like all and some, right, the logical quantifiers for all x, x is p or something like that, right? So the very signifier x, the very signifier all, right, the quantifier all also has a meaning, right? It's not merely just an empty symbol that we can manipulate any type of way we want, but its meaning kind of constrains what we can do with it, right? It kind of restricts and limits what we can do with it. So that's one way I would argue that there is really no purely formal logic, right? And they may also come into Quine's camp in a certain sense, although I don't think that's what he really wanted to argue for in that way. But now I'll pass on to Quine's critique of the analytic static distinction, and I will try to explain that in a bit more detail. So first of all, I'm going to just offer perhaps a better example of homonymy that I found online. For instance, you have words like bear, right? So bear could signify a type of animal. It can also signify the relation of enduring or carrying the weight of something, like an adjective, or actually, I think it would be a verb to bear something, right? So that's one example, better example perhaps of homonymy. Or for instance, meat and meat, right? So they're spelled differently. Meat, M-E-E-T, would be, the situation where you commune with somebody, or maybe you run up into them accidentally. And M-E-A-T would be the edible substance or the food derived from an animal's body or something like that, right? So that's it for that. Now I'm going to be talking about how the logical positivists, Carnap, Ayer, and people like that, right, who took the analytic static distinction to be exclusive. So those are only two kinds of meaningful statements, right, the analytic synthetic. And also they thought that all analytic statements are a priori and all synthetic statements are a posteriori, right? So there's no possible case of a meaningful statement that is synthetic a priori, which I also talk about in some of my other in some of my other videos, as well as my posts on social media. So I don't think Quine necessarily has a problem with that kind of equation of analytic with a priori and synthetic with a posteriori. So I don't think Quine would want to admit synthetic a priori, but Quine wants to talk against the possibility of analytic statements pure and simple, right? So there are no pure analytic statements, because all statements, or analytic statements that are not, as I said, reliant merely on the logical form of the statement, so they depend also on the meaning of the constituent terms, like bachelors are married men. John is a bachelor, therefore John is an unmarried man. There's also inference that will be warranted if we accept that kind of form of analyticity. Right, so Quine wants to challenge that actually, and Quine wants to say, I mean, he has a few arguments. I'll post here on the screen something I read in an article which lists actually 5 arguments, or 5 types of arguments across Quine's corpus, across perhaps even a few decades of his philosophical career. Where he talks about different aspects, different things that are troublesome and that are worrisome, that are wrong, so to speak, with analytic synthetic distinction. But I will focus here on pretty much his argument from the 2 dogmas of empiricism, more or less, right? Maybe he talked about it in other places as well, but pretty much he's I think the crux of his argument is that, you know, the truth of those analytic statements that are not true in virtue of the logical form alone, so those that are true in virtue of the logical form plus the meaning of the constituent terms, right? The truth of those statements is reliant not merely on some external facts, empirical facts, objective states of affairs. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but it's reliant. Quine's problem is that it is reliant on conventions. I think that is pretty much this central point of his critique. It's reliant on conventions, and conventions are merely more or less arbitrary postulates or stipulations of what certain terms are supposed to mean. So we cannot really have analytic truths other than the merely logical ones that are true in some kind of substantive or robust way, because their truth is dependent on the arbitrary convention or the pragmatic, practical, linguistic convention of a certain speaker or community of speakers or users of language. And those the meanings of the terms that are used in the supposed analytic sentence are not really given. I guess co-given with the terms are going to be eternal or absolute truths about what those words mean, but are merely our own ways of specifying what the terms mean, which are arbitrary, which are pragmatic, which are not really true in some heavy sense of truth. So I think that would be Quine's critique, and he also relies on he also talks about the notion of synonymy, right? Because those analytic truths rely on under many popular renditions rely on the notion of synonymy, because we say that, you know, analytic truths are truths that have the subject term and the predicate term are synonymous, pretty much, right? Or at least the one falls under the other. I think we could also say, in terms of the, you know, containment within the extension of a certain predicate, perhaps. So the genus-species relation or something like that, right? I think that may also, in some sense, be an analytic truth, but not in completely the same sense, right? But also, I would say, part of the problem with Quine's critique of the analytic synthetic distinction, or the validity of the analytic truths, is that the problem with that critique is that I think it could also be applied to synthetic truths as well, right? Because the meaning or the truth, even the possible truth of the synthetic, so-called synthetic statements, which are supposed to be pretty much all statements according to Quine, because he doesn't think that analytic statements are really exist, purely analytic statements. And the difference wouldn't be a difference in kind, it would be a difference in degree. It wouldn't really be some kind of contradictory or oppositional relation, but will be simply the gradual difference in the degree of empirical and conventional support that these statements have, right? But I think that kind of critique can also be addressed to the synthetic statements, because they too depend partly on the meanings of constituent terms, right? Of course, because how can we say that any sentence is true if we do not have some kind of idea what the sentence mean? We don't perhaps don't need to have an explicit definition, but we can have we need to have some kind of idea, some kind of understanding of what the constituent terms mean, right? Which are also dependent on convention, right? So the only difference between synthetic and analytic truths is that the analytic truths are dependent merely on the convention or merely on the meaning, and the synthetic truths are dependent on the meaning plus some kind of extra linguistic or external or empirical or objective fact or state of affairs, right? Something about the world also that makes those synthetic sentences true, in addition to the meaning of the terms. But we also must take into consideration the meaning as well, right? So if there are no analytic truths because meaning is conventional, so there are also no synthetic truths because meaning of those terms as well that occur in static prepositions are also conventional, right? That's what I would say. I think that's the crux of my critique of Quine on this issue, on this point. So yeah, now I will talk briefly about my own sort of theory and how we may even complicate these matters even further, and I'm not sure how close to Quine that kind of critique is, but it may have some kind of parallel, some kind of correspondences with Quine, but I don't think he problematized it in the exact sense that I do, right? And I haven't really encountered exact. I've encountered some very similar ideas, but in other authors, in other places. But I have not really encountered that kind of theory as I presented as a whole, right? Or at least as an ongoing body of understanding and conceptions and theories, right? Ongoing and developing body of theories, right? So the kind of critique of synthetic analytic distinction by Quine is supposed to undermine a few very major philosophical movements and tendencies. It's supposed to undermine logicism for one, right? Which is defended at least by the early Russell, by the logical positivists, by Frege, for instance, right? People like that. Supposed to undermine the motivation for logicism. Supposed to critique and challenge and attack logicism, but also it's supposed to argue for the meaning holism or verificational holism in the philosophy of language and philosophy of science, where, you know, as Quine says, our statements our statements face the tribunal of a sense experience, which is supposed to be their testing ground. They don't face it. They don't face that tribunal of sense experience in isolation, or not just particular statements in isolation, but they face it as a body, as a collection of statements, maybe as a system of statements. Those are some things that Quine wants to derive from this kind of critique, this kind of argumentative strategy. But I would say to that, I already said pretty much what the bulk of my critique, what the crux of my critique, what the crux of my problem with Quine is on that point. But also want to advance a bit further my own speculations, my own reflections on the topic of language, on the topic of logic, right? Even on the topic of science, and how all those are supposed to be related. Because I don't think one can be completely separated from the others, completely independent from the others. Because all of our science and all of our statements about reality depend on the structure of our language, right? They also inherit its inherent limitations, right? So one thing I would say, so Quine wants to argue for the underdetermination of theory by fact or theory by data, right? So there's a problem in the philosophy of science. I think problem with some kind of very confident trust in the powers of science, scientific theorizing. It is also a problem with radical translation. So translation of a language of a society that we never encountered before, for instance, that is sort of a thought of experiment, but it also can be perhaps realized and tested. So we have a problem with translating a language which we don't have any dictionary for, because any kind of expression, any kind of utterance by the speakers of that language can be interpreted in many different ways. I would say under many different ontological schemes, ontological frameworks. And that is sort of the ontological relativity that Quine wants to argue for. So merely the statements themselves do not completely tell us how to translate them into our language. So there are perhaps no perfect correspondence, or at least we can have no knowledge of the perfect correspondence of the expressions from different languages, which is also connected and I think relies on the privacy of mental contents or mental experience, subjective experience. So we cannot really have direct insight into another's mental states, mental contents. We can also only have his behavior at our disposal to judge and to make stipulations and theories about. So that is part of Quine's at least methodological behaviorism, if not full, I guess, psychological or metaphysical even behaviorism. But one thing I would say that, Quine says that, data, the empirical data, underdetermine theories, right? So empirical data itself, empirical facts themselves, do not completely specify what kind of theories are true about those data, because again, conventions are relevant, and the same body of empirical data can be interpretable and can be understandable in multiple frameworks, multiple schemes, ontological, scientific, theoretical schemes, linguistic schemes, conceptual schemes. So the data themselves do not have only one possible interpretation, which is the one true theory, which is the one true account of what is actually the case, what is actually at hand, what is actually in front of us when we make scientific observations and experiments, and also when we experience things in our everyday life, right? But I will also say, which I think is sort of a interesting proposal, that the theory also underdetermines the data. So it also goes out, the underdetermination also can be reversed or goes the other way around as well, because uh, our language, our linguistic utterances, linguistic expressions, our theories, which are formulated in language, right? Whether ordinary language or some kind of mathematical or logical language, they do not completely determine what possible reference they can have or possible situations that can be correctly applied to. So I would say, to take it to a logical extreme, I would say that to give some kind of definition, perhaps, of that kind of underdetermination of data by theory, or of, I guess, objects by words, or the world by language, or whatever. So we can have a certain theory. A theory is pretty much a conglomeration, or at best a system of sentences, of statements in language, right? There's nothing more than that, really. It's just an organized body of sentences. So if you take a single sentence, but it can also be applied to theories as wholes. All right, a single sentence formulated in language, or a single word in language, can perhaps be given a linguistic definition, a verbal definition. But we can have potentially infinite number of in different variations of the possible a possible reference and a possible correspondence, possible situations of application of that word. And the sentences themselves, or the verbal definitions of words, right? The verbal explanations of theories, perhaps, do not really specify to an absolute exactitude all and only, right? All and only the relevant possible situations to which it can be applied. So that's one thing I would say here. It's a kind of very general and abstract formulation, but that pretty much means that we cannot give necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a single word or a single sentence or even a whole theory, right? I think my theory works for all of those units of a language, from the smallest one, which is the word, to the largest one, which is the theory or whatever. I think theories are pretty much the largest, at least the largest unified and organized bodies of linguistic expression. So there are no necessary and sufficient conditions, which means that there will, in principle, always be those situations where we are unsure whether the theory applies to it or whether the theory is correct of the relevant data, for instance, right? And also we cannot really have any kind of objective standard by which theory independent standard by which we decide whether the theory is correct of the state of affairs, right? Of the, I guess, some kind of natural system, natural phenomenon. We cannot have objective and universal prescriptions or standards for deciding that in every conceivable case. So that is one thing I would say in very general terms here, in very abstract terms here. And I'm pretty much satisfied with this video as it went on so far, although it is much longer than I initially intended it to be. But I will leave it at that for now. I hope you enjoyed what I presented here. I hope it made sense to you. I hope you were able to understand it. I hope you took something valuable from it. And if that is the case, I would advise or urge you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. As well as, if you want, you can follow me on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, or my blogs. I have blogs on WordPress and Substack. And also, if you want, you can also support me in a financial kind of way via my PayPal account, which I will post a link to in the description, which will mean a lot to me, which will actually enable me to do this sort of work long term and full time, right? In the future, right? Which I will greatly appreciate. And that's it for now. And until next time, goodbye to everyone and have a great day.